Welcome to Poets House live streaming. My name is Paulo Javier, Poet and Program Director of Poets House, broadcasting tonight from Lenapehoking, specifically the unceded territory of the Rockaway, Canarsie, and Matinacock peoples, otherwise known as Queens County, New York City. Tonight marks the third program of our online series of live streamed events, and I'm so eager to be welcoming our guest tonight, Heid Erdrich, who will be presenting on her work as both author of Little Big Bully, her national poetry series winning collection that just came out this month from Penguin, and also as editor of the long overdue and essential and brilliant anthology New Poets of Native Nations, published in 2018 by Graywolf. And it's an anthology that is the recipient of an American Book Award from the Before Columbus Foundation and a Midwest Booksellers' Choice Award. Heid Erdrich is the author of 7 collections of poetry. Her writing has won fellowships and awards from the Native Arts and Cultures Foundation, the McKnight Foundation, the Minnesota State Arts Board, the Bush Foundation, the Loft Literary Center, and First Peoples Fund, and she has twice won a Minnesota Book Award for poetry. Erdrich works as a visual arts curator and collaborator and as an educator. She teaches in the low residency MFA creative writing program of Augsburg University and is a 2019 Distinguished Visiting Professor in the Liberal Arts at the University of Minnesota, Morris. Erdrich grew up in Wahpeton, North Dakota, and is Ojibwe enrolled at Turtle Mountain. She lives in Minneapolis. Streaming from Minneapolis tonight, I'm so pleased and honored to be welcoming Heid to our program this evening.
Miigwech, Paulo, and crew, I'm so glad to be here. Buju Anin, Buju Nijinabe Dok, Heid Erdrich Indigenous, Jaganashimong, Majikwe Indigo, Anishinaabe Moin, Makwan Dodam, Dakota King and Dunjaba, Minawa Mikanek Wajuing. My name is Heid Erdrich, and I am Anishinaabe Ojibwe from Turtle Mountain Band of Ojibwe, and I grew up in Dakota country, and I live in Dakota Village now here in Minneapolis. I want to talk to you about Native poetry. What can we learn from Native poets? Having worked with a number of Native poets over the past 5 years to first create New Poets of Native Nations from Graywolf Press, and at almost the same time as I was finishing New Poets of Native Nations from Graywolf Press, I edited a full issue of Poetry Magazine with all Native poets. What we can learn is the first thing that I said when I looked at who I had and who I'd learned from, and they put on the back of the cover of the book, is that there's no such thing as Native poetry. In the introduction to this issue of Poetry Magazine, I had 2 jobs to do, and one was to talk a little bit about the craft of editing any body of work by poets, and a little bit about the particular issue of working with Indigenous poets' works. And it starts out the way all my work starts out, with an image. I move from image into the meat of the matter, the argument, or the story. It usually starts with something visual or a sensory image. So this is how this one came to me, and I carried it around knowing I had this task to do. An egg shape, blue but heavily waxed over in a dense translucence like an iced cake. Sometimes writing starts with a shape and then we fill it. These words had to collect over time, filling an egg with indigo until it felt exactly the right shape and heft. I did this because I had a duty to Native poets, and the ones that you would read in this anthology, this collection of poetry, or New Poets of Native Nations, became something that I said felt heavy and impossible to balance like an egg. There's a proportion to the writing I imagined, 3-to-1 with a belt and button. That was actually like a voice in a dream told me to shape it that way. And it made no sense at all at first. Still, I knew that I would begin by telling you all something important said to others before me. There is no such thing as Native American poetry. And the reason I said that is because Native nations are individual and distinct. We have different traditions. We have our own poetic traditions. We may be related in some ways, and we certainly have political connections and even many shared cultural connections that have happened post-colonially. However, a Native poetics is something that hasn't yet distinguished itself in the English. So then why collect poets into an anthology like New Native Poetry, and why try to figure out what we can learn from Native poets who are writing in English? I think the main reason is because so few people really knew who contemporary Native poets were who were writing today. I mean, we knew each other, we recognized each other, and there were some poets gaining a lot of attention. There was a great deal of education and effort through the Institute of the American Indian Arts and through particular presses to begin to expand, I guess, what we can only call the canon of Native literature. And I felt I wanted to be part of that. But since this book came out in 2018, another 2 anthologies came out, one from Copper Canyon, and this one just came out, which is When the Light of the World Was Subdued, Our Songs Came Through. It's the first Norton anthology of Native poetry. It spans from the beginning of the US as a country and into the contemporary times. So with 500 and some odd Native nations that are recognized by one another and by the US federal government, trying to decide how a book could represent Native poets left me only with an idea that perhaps I would just look at anything. No theme, no set boundaries on what would be submitted to me, look through people's first books and get a sense of what I liked and put it into this collection together and see how it started a conversation, a speaking from one poem to the next poem. So that was the other part of my editing task. Fill out a shape and understand that there's 2 sides to it. There's an egg shape, hard to balance, with some sort of belt in the middle, a kind of dividing line between very large sides to an object or a problem. I'm going to read a few poems from the collection just to help make my point. There's very brief poems, and I've been given permission to read from them by the authors. The first author is Tacey Atsitty, and she's Dene, or Navajo, and she holds a bachelor's degree from Brigham Young University and the Institute of American Indian Arts, an MFA in creative writing from Cornell. And her first book was Rain Scald in 2018. One of the things that Tacey taught me when I worked on this book was that I would work from the newest poets back to the earliest published in the 21st century. And I made that decision in looking at how poets write about time. And because we're people who are supposed to be connected to ancientness in a very new country, the United States, we often have to respond to what people think of our ancestors. And this poem does exactly that, and talking about the Anasazi, the ancestors of the desert people of the United States Southwest. Tacey Atsitty, Anasazi. How can we die when we're already prone to leaving the table mid-meal, like ancient ones gone to breathe elsewhere? Salt sits still, but pepper's gone, rolled off in a rush. We've practiced dying for a long time, when we skip dance or town, when we chew. We've rounded out like dining room walls in a canyon, eaten through by wind. Sorry we rushed off. The food wasn't ours. Sorry the grease sits white on our plates. And the jam that didn't set, use it as syrup to cover every theory of us. So that's Tacey Atsitty. The poets in this collection are not all young poets, even though they're new in the 20th century. And what I appreciate about that, in including them in New Poets of Native Nations, is that it illustrates an understanding of how long it took for American poetry to open to Native poets. And in fact, I make the point both in my introduction to Poetry magazine and in the introduction to this anthology that American poetry was much more accepting of people who wrote about natives, wrote in the style of natives, and whole schools of poetry had that feel to it, the sort of native themed, centered, and many poets posed as native in order to create their poetic persona. When you ask for actual poets to do these things, they may do something you don't expect. This is Gwenneil Westerman, who is a poet who is older, and she had her first book in 2013, as well as working on many other books that will be out soon, I hope. This is a short poem that I think of as an anti land acknowledgement poem in a way. It's about a time in Minnesota when there was supposed to be a reconciliation between the Dakota people and their descendants who'd had fought a bitter war right around the time of the Civil War. Dakota Homecoming. We are so honored that you are here, they said. We know that this is your homeland, they said. The admission price is $5, they said. Here is your button for the event, they said. It means so much to us that you are here, they said. We want to write an apology letter, they said. Tell us what to say. So I've deliberately picked some of these brief poems, but they illustrate so well how one of the jobs of the Native poets is to defy expectation and to discuss that the issue of how our poetry is asked to portray us spiritually as nature people, to maybe be political in a more pointed way. And it also doesn't include the humor that I find in Native poetry. People don't usually say, hey, I'm doing a humor issue. Where are all the Native poets, right? So this poet is Trevino L. Brings Plenty. And Trevino is Cheyenne, born on the Cheyenne Sioux River Reservation in Eagle Butte, South Dakota. His books are Real Indian Junk Jewelry from 2012 and Wakpawanagi Ghost River 2015. And this is a poem that Trevino's allowed me to read. Also a short one called For the Sake of Beauty. On the phone, I asked her to wear a full buckskin outfit, and she could be the beauty that would make me steal horses. She said she didn't have a buckskin outfit. I said I would make her one, but use pages from books. A week later, she came over to my place and asked if I had made an outfit. I said no. I couldn't bring myself to hunt the books on my shelf, even if it were for food or clothing. I couldn't bring myself to kill, even for the sake of beauty. So Trevino's poem deals with that sort of warrior self and the notion of the hunting and the buckskin outfit, and that is expected. Hoahwah is another poet. He is Comanche and Southern Arapaho. He has an MFA from the University of Arkansas and has had an NEA fellowship in literature. His first book was Velroy Medici and the Medici Mafia in 2009, Night Cradle in 2011, and Ancestral Demon of a Grieving Bride is out, I believe. I'm going to read Sai's poem, not from New Poets of Native Nations, but from poetry. This one's called Tiffany. This is the deepest part of the world. Bird don't fly here, but there is the sound of wings. The smell, just a struggle in the earth, underneath the musty floorboards. Monsters hatch fully grown from their eggs, Snaky legs indicate chaos. I carry sad omens, slobber down the psychic's legs to her feet pointed backwards. I roll off the back of a skull strapped on top of a fox whose shape shifts into the irresistible. A Christian, Oklahoma-shaped and melancholic, caught in the entrance of a ditch as the best breath of me tornadoes into the next county. So that one's from Hoahwah. And I think that both of these last two poems and the first two poems illustrate that idea that although we could phrase our work in some expected places, talking about ancestors, talking about land acknowledgement and history between tribal people and colonial people and settlers, or phrasing something expected like a love poem, or even a sort of Comanche goth poem, the way Sai does, can create a level of denied expectation that could be really exciting for a reader. And they can do it in a short piece as well as in some longer work, so it doesn't become a complicated essay or a polemic. It's imagistic, quick, and made to give the poet, I think, a chance to present a framework that one would not imagine around Native poets from whatever group they're from. So I like including a little bit of a sense of who these poets are as well in terms of their ability with English poetry and the traditions in English poetry. And each of those poets has worked with a form. Tacey Atsitty in particular has worked with sonnet sequences and lacings, sonnets redoubled, and is producing work in fairly large publications, a fairly large number of poems in publications that show her extended sonnet sequencing. And what I learned from working with all these Native poets has in a way come to be part of my own work. Not the smallest part of it is just the feeling of conversation, understanding the way poets in the English tradition have always been able to understand what their tradition is because they could pick up other poets who were like them. They could have anthologies that they were taught and classics that they were taught. This was not something that I received in my education as a Native woman getting, an undergraduate degree, going through an MFA, and working, eventually getting a PhD. There were not there was no Norton Anthology of Native Poetry. There were not Native edited publications. These things weren't there for me. So in being able to read, become familiar with, and understand the conversation between poets and the conversation of various types of Native poets, I feel like I ended up having some influence that was not just on the page, but in the sense of how I knew I would be read. Knowing how you will be read among which other poets you might either be compared or echo or have, another poet whose work's out at the same time as you is also something that most Native poets were never afforded. Often you were the only Native poet published in a fairly traditional publication for the year, and new poets were slow to come. And so this is something that I think we've needed and wanted for a long time, and something that helped me very much in my next book. I think I'm going to talk a little bit about my new book that's just out, Little Big Bully. And Poets House was nice enough to have me do a 10-minute reading, so I have several poems from the 10-minute reading that I'll refer to, and hopefully you'll have a chance to look at those as well. But I'm going to start with the first poem in the book. It's a poem called How. And you can see that it's a a block of a poem, a prose poem. And how in many ways came directly from working with other Native poets, from beginning to have that thing that's fairly new for us, a diverse and diasporic group of people that we relate to, that we've begun to have some conversation with and among. And it has to do with a time when writers were airing their differences on social media, basically. And everyone was airing their differences on social media. That's social media, right? But Little Big Bully is a lot about how human narcissistic tendencies are amplified and continue to create the sort of bullying behaviors of childhood and early adolescence into abusive relationships, into abusive structures, and how that echoes. So this poem is called How. How did we get here? How did we get to this place of bullying? How loves, how I love you, how we hang on words, how eaten with need, how we need to eat, how weevils sift the wheat, how cold it is, how thick with hoar frost, ice slick, sleet freeze, how wintry the mix, how full of angst, how gut sick, how blue-lipped, how we drink a health, how we care, how easy over as eggs. Yeah, how it all slides, how absurd, how yet tender we all, how wrapped in a thick coat, how battered, how slender the flesh, how we wrap ourselves, how many selves we all, how I miss you many, how I see you, how your eyes warm mine, how tiny am I inside, how enormous my need, how you open an old-fashioned satchel, how deep it yawns, bleak this need, how like winter, how it yet catches the light, how brilliant the sundog's perihelion, moondog's parasaline phenomenon, optic, how fetching your spectacles, how my thumbs might fit alongside the slope of your nose, how my own glasses slide down my thin bridge, how ridiculous the theory of the land bridge, how inane the bibble babble, how we grew to be friends, how we grew thumbs, how opposable we all, how we grew sparks, how we blew up a fire, how angry, how incensed, how we resist, how we bead up drops, how water will not run, how we distract, how loud the dog snores, how loudly, how noisy the snow grows, how many degrees below, how we fret, how again, how we all came here, how did we come, how loves, how did we come to this? So that's just a little bit from the beginning, the first poem in Little Big Bully.
Thank you so much, Heid. There's a lot that I'd like to discuss with you, of course. And first of all, congratulations on this book, Little Big Bully, which is beautifully designed. And I mean, immediately I'm struck by your choice of artists, the design, the conscious design that went into this book, but also mindful of the fact that it's a book that's going to reach a lot of readers, right? By virtue of the publisher, Penguin. It's like a major book just in terms of distribution and in terms of visibility. And I wanted to, I guess, begin there, talk about how you put this book together in terms of the collection itself, the poems that went into it, and then if you're willing to talk about the business side of it, the industry side of it, right? Putting the book together physically, keeping in mind that this is a major prize, and that for me, reading this book made me feel that it seems distinct from a lot of books that we see entered in winning prizes in terms of how specific this book is. Not so much a collection, but a sequence of poems. And I would just love to know more, hear more from you, how this came to be, Little Big Bully came to be.
Thanks. The first thing I tell people is similar to what I said when I was talking about how I was going to make the issue of Poetry magazine work, how I was going to collect things for New Poets of Native Nations. I had a shape in my head first, and when I went to look at which poems I had, I felt some of them fit that shape and some didn't. And this shape did have an arc to it. It felt somewhat experiential, but it also felt that it would be a question with many answers. And that's how I knew the poem How was the first poem. It's not even in any of the sections. It comes before the 4 sections. But those sections came later anyhow, so they weren't in there when I sent the manuscript off. The other thing I tell people is that a lot of the poems were written or significantly revised during the polar vortex of 2019. It was just bitterly, surpassingly cold. And I live in Minnesota and I love the cold. I grew up in North Dakota in the 70s and it was as cold as it was then. It was just profound. It took your breath away every day if you had to leave the house. And there were many days when they said, don't leave your house, which is very rare. The kids were out of school for a total of 5 days. There were 10 days straight when we were just freezing in our own homes. It was very, very cold in the house even. And I, bundled up and started going through my work to see what I had and whether I had a new book. As I started sifting the poems into the collection and writing poems to fill in between, I felt the sense of series maybe that you're describing, that there were certain poems that would fit together, that were speaking one to the other. I always think of it like, I used to smoke. It's like chain smoking, you light one off the other. So there was a little bit of that in how the poems began to shape and shift into the form of the book. But for the most part, I really just moved from a larger question through some past, childhood past, as well as just the past of my young womanhood, into the current and the political, and things that have happened in my adult life into the future in the end. So there was a sort of narrative shape to it, although it's not really a story and it's not really a memoir. It is, for me, one of the first books where most of what happens in the book, and most of the event-based poems are based on what I experienced or witnessed firsthand.
I wanted to, if I may, ask you some more about how you found yourself writing poetry. Speaking of thinking back to young womanhood and your childhood, can you maybe remember for me when you discovered poetry and when it became something manifest in your daily practice, and maybe connecting us to this moment with the polar vortex, which seemed to really inspire you, and look where those poems ended up, right, in this very powerful, amazing collection. So what was it like for you? How did you find poetry? How did poetry find you?
I was a kid who liked to do art, and my mother's a visual artist. I thought that, the best thing I could do would be a children's book illustrator. I thought there was nothing more wonderful in the world than the illustrations and the books I loved. I had not yet read poems by Native poets when I was a child. I had not even thought of it. And we had a poet in the schools visit, the person who did the little poetry exercise with gave me a lot of praise. And I thought, wow, maybe I should do this instead of being a visual artist. But I continued with my desire to, be a scholar and a visual artist and maybe a teacher until I was in high school. And it became clear to me that it was an expensive and extremely competitive field, visual art. And because I had an 18-year-old or 16-year-old brain, I thought poetry is easier and less competitive. So I started sending out my poems to be published. And luckily, I did get a few publications, which encouraged me into college. And in college, I had great teachers. And I think that's the key always, is if a teacher has faith in you, you will continue your work. I was working for a small police station, and my graduate professor, or my undergraduate professor, called me and said, what are you doing? You have to go to graduate school, or you'll be doing whatever you're doing tonight the rest of your life. And I said, okay, then I will apply for graduate school, because I was really just about done working with the police. It gives you a grim view of the world, even though you're needed and wanted and you can help people every day. It was exactly what you can imagine, and has formed my opinion of policing ever since. So I went away to graduate school, and 5 years later entered a contest, the other contest I entered, and got my first book published. So that's kind of how I moved through my earliest years with poetry. And I had pretty classic education, went through my Sylvia Plath phase, discovered Louise Gluck, and, fell in love with voice, and moved on from there.
I see the visual influence on your work, just how your poems expand across the page. The purposeful disconnect between line breaks and how the words sound, but really to underscore the spacing between them. But at the same time, I get a really immediate, urgent sense of these poems being performed with my imaginary voice in my head of the speakers speaking in. But I was reading each poem in your collection out loud to myself and to our second daughter over the weekend recently. And it really, it struck me as, perhaps this is a question that I can ask you in terms of composition, when you're making the poems in Little Big Bully and perhaps early on, do you see a specific method of composing poems, or is it very specific to the sequence or project?
Yeah, I have gone through many loves in the way I put a poem on the page. I have, I think this is my 7th published book of poetry. I have an 8th mixed genre poetry collection that will come out at some point from Tinderbox, but the books are all very different from one another. And somewhere in my last book, before Big Bully, I started to feel I was not interested in punctuation and end stopping lines, and not as interested in jamming lines as I had been. What I wanted to do was, spread the lines out across the page. So they do this sort of thing. And the white space, I think of that as a breath. I started writing breath scripts for performing my poetry so that I could understand where I should slow down for my listeners. I love to perform poetry. I think of poetry as a perform genre as much as it is on the page. And I really wanted to bring those two things together in a way that would translate for my readers. I wanted that so much. And what I didn't even think of was, what the heck would a publisher do with poems that wide? And luckily, Penguin went right to bat for me on that. And before I even asked the question, said they were going to give it the biggest trim size they could. So it's a big, wide book. So, it covers my face. It's a big book. And I'm really grateful for that. And so that the visual aspects of the poems are definitely a huge part of my work. They're a response to working with visual artists as a curator, as someone who writes about visual art, and with my sense of a poem as a sculptural object.
I'm a huge fan, actually, of this particular size, and it reminds me of some other books that have been published in the series. A book published in the series that's very dear to me is Ted Berrigan's Selected Poems, that was curated by Alice Notley. Your role as a curator, be it in the visual arts and poetry, did this unfold early on, or is this something that you inhabited more frequently as each book came out? What has your relationship been like in terms of a poet and an editor? Because this is not something I take for granted. I don't see this all the time. And I'm grateful to see this spirit, but I also know it's hard to wear both hats and be in both roles.
Yeah, you're right. It is difficult. One of the things that, I'm a teacher too. I've taught poetry for a long time. I teach MFA students for the most part now. And one of the things that's the hardest to teach is that moment when you become a good editor of your own work. And the only way to practice it really is to edit other poets, and that's how the whole workshop, I believe, came to be. There's some immediate gratification or mortification when others read your work, but there's also that necessity of learning how to uh, create a response, and have some sense of how the heck you are going to change uh, um, the person's understanding of their poem. Maybe not change lines. And as an editor, you don't always do that. You might ask people to move things around. You might ask questions until you understand the poem better and appreciate it better. At least that's what I do as both a teacher and an editor. So that's sort of where that skill fits in, I think. I did edit another anthology years ago, and I swore I would never, ever do another one. But the idea for New Poets of Native Nations came to me about 4 years before it was published, and it felt really like something that was needed. So I gave myself to that task. It's a difficult task. I won't kid you. It's very much busy work. And any curation of poetry or art uses the same skill set, and it's keeping track of multiple people and trying to do the best by their work. So when I left full-time teaching, I had a tenure track job and it was not working for me or my family. I decided to walk away from my tenure track job. That night that I made the decision, I went to a native art show with some friends who had their artwork up, and the curator grabbed me as I was literally going out the door and said, "What are you doing right now?" And I laughed and I said, "Well, I just decided I'm going to quit my job." And she said, "Do you want my job?" And I said, "I don't know if I could do that." And she said, "Well, you've been an editor, right? It's the same job." So, I let that guide me, and it has ever since. And it's really, truly a beautiful thing to be able to work with visual art and do the best by visual artists, and sometimes collaborate with them too. That was something I never thought I'd be able to do. And, certainly having an interdisciplinary background has allowed me to understand how poetry can work with other disciplines and visual disciplines as well. So I feel really super lucky that that happened to me, because I didn't really know what a curator was when I started being one.
One of my admirations for your anthology and your introduction is the framing of the anthology itself. The anthology itself as a book can easily slip into gatekeeping, and the introduction that you offer, as expansive and generous as it is, it actually points to the gatekeeping that has allowed for a lack of anthologies featuring poets from native nations to be published. And I just keep thinking about some anthologies that, as an Asian American, I've grown up really appreciating Walter Liu's anthology from the 90s called Premonitions, where he created zones and really made it uneasy for the reader and for the presenters and participants themselves to feel stable in the term Asian Pacific Islander American poetry. And what I love about how you frame in your book that you are aware of the different audiences you have, the different communities that you're going to be connecting with, the different nations, but also more importantly, the tradition that this book will be coming out of, and this conscious articulating that you're mindful that this is one more anthology that will continue, that will branch out, that will yield others. And I don't take this kind of deliberation for granted, just because also of the temptation that's available to anyone to be an editor of an anthology that gathers a certain kind of poetry and gives certain visibility. Could you speak to what the trajectory for your vision for this anthology was like in the outset, and then how it came to be?
Yeah, I think I like I said early on, part of my trick of editing and writing too is to get things, look at them, and then figure it out. So I only knew that I wanted to showcase writers who folks may not have heard of, or whose careers started late because frankly, there were many publishers who would say, we have our native poet, and they wouldn't publish another native poet because it seemed, fair to have one, given how few native poets there are. But if you have one poet from one nation, then, there are still 575 other nations. It doesn't make any sense to me that that would be your one native poet. The idea of the umbrella around us has really been a problem. It's also useful, but it's a problem. So, I felt like I wanted this book to be very relevant in the moment and to have some legs. The poems, I think, are all strong poems and interesting. They don't have a theme that we might get tired about later, or that would be, would pigeonhole these writers, that they write about, one particular thing, or they write from one particular region. Native peoples are diasporic. Most of us live in urban areas. Most of us don't live on reservations. Of course, I wanted voices from all those places, and I did try to think a little bit about the regions of the country. I wanted people from, north, south, east, west, and in the middle. But most anthologies of Native people tend to put them into almost anthropological groups, so that we're like, in our culture group, sometimes the region of the country. But I didn't want to do anything like that, because I wanted it to last, and I wanted it to be a good example of the first almost 20 years of the 21st century. That there are other anthologies out right on the heels of it, I think, is fantastic. It means that you don't only have one book to teach if you want to teach a course on Native poetry. And because I couldn't get everybody into it who I wanted everybody to have at least one first book. I was able, with the poetry magazine, to include people whose books came out after I'd made my selection. So I think of it as like, iterations. It's going to go on and on and on. And I'm glad to have been part of that. If it, I don't want it to be a Bible of any sort. Don't tell Graywolf I said that. They probably want it to be the Bible. But I'm really grateful. And I'm grateful that it was Graywolf. I mean, there's so many fantastic poets associated with Graywolf, and I wanted a book with an audience of poetry loving, poetry reading folks, so that this message would come through. There are a diverse number of Native poets, and it's growing all the time.
Yeah, in many ways, your anthology resists all the anthologies of its kind. I mean, just in terms of anthology based on identity, by the deliberate care, generosity, humility with which the anthology announces itself, presents itself. You offer dialogue, or an opportunity for the poets themselves to speak in the book, to give their perspective. And in your introduction, you resist outrightly that, this is not intended to be an anthology of Native poetry in capital letters, right? It resists that designation and specifies a connection to first books, which is, I think, really cool, that you're giving it, you're privileging from a certain time period, but you're also privileging another form in which poetry by poets from Native nations come out. And you're back and forth with Graywolf. Would you talk about that? Because it's such a special anthology. It's groundbreaking in many ways. Could you talk about how that negotiation was?
It was wonderful. I mean, Jeff Schatz is just a prince. He was wonderful to me about the work. He was gracious. He was open, had excellent critique. There's nobody who knows contemporary poetry better or appreciates diverse styles better. So I felt extremely lucky to work with Jeff and to have him get what I was trying to do, to support it, and not to ever make me feel like this wasn't my boat that I was rowing. And that's not something that happens for everybody. I have been extremely lucky and wonderful editors my entire publishing career. And the same is true with Little Big Bully. I just have nothing but respect and appreciation, because I know how poorly the situation could go, and has gone for other people I've worked with. So, I think I've been lucky that I've been able to work with people who aren't so interested in slamming the gates as opening them. And, for me, that was a great experience, even down to the design of Little Big Bully. And the same goes for New Poets of Native Nations. To have any input into design is just a favor that your press does you, right? But my working with Native artists always makes me want to foreground them and give them, whatever chance I can. So I always have Native artists on the covers of my books. The cover of New Poets of Native Nations is an image taken by Sherwin Bitsoy, another great poet who had his first books in the 21st century from Copper Canyon, who declined to be in the collection, but gave me, he just didn't have new work. He had these book-length poems, basically, so it's very difficult to excerpt those things. But he did give me the image for the cover when I asked for it, so I was really grateful for that. The cover art on Little Big Bully, my new book, is Andrea Carlson. And this actual image, which is a print, will be on display on the High Line from the Whitney, and it will be there from 2021 February to 2021 September. So I'm thrilled to have Anishinaabe Kwe, my fellow Ojibwe woman, artist and collaborator, be on display in such an amazing space. So hopefully you all see that.
I'll definitely check it out when it's launched or installed, when it's installed. I also really love in your anthology the expansiveness of forms, and from playfulness to the decentering of the poem in your anthology. You mentioned Sherwin. Sherwin is a poet whose work I read a lot. I turn to Layli Long Soldier's work. Julian Brolaski, I love Julian's work. I've always loved Julian's work, and Orlando White. So experimental poets are included in your anthology. And I wanted to ask you, is your sense, not to speak for all the poets, but your sense as an editor, what is, and I'm not expecting one set answer, but what sense the relationship to English did the anthology have, in terms of capturing it? As a Filipino, I'm always conscious that I'm writing in English, with a mind to unconsciously troubling it, adoring it, but mostly doing a little bit of both, maybe more of one than the other.
That is such a fascinating thing. And I've had my own work with Anishinaabe my Ojibwe language, studied it as an adult. My grandfather was the last person in our family to speak it fluently. Although the younger generation are now gaining fluency, and one of my nieces is an immersion school teacher in Ojibwe language. So it's a big part of my life and thinking. I've edited books in Anishinaabe. One of the poets that you mentioned, Orlando White, who's not in New Poets of Native Nations, does such a great job in describing how language and learning English when you have an indigenous language in your heart, how that conflict or that juxtaposition works. And I admire that work a great deal. Sherwin Bitsoy often writes with a Dene language, Navajo language, in his work too, but so do number of the poets in New Poets of Native Nations. And I do have a fondness for that. So if a poem included in English an indigenous language, I was more likely to look at that poem or that poet. It is something I've always found interesting. And it may not be something that creates the best entrance for poets who aren't familiar with indigenous work, because they're not going to know the language. It's not easy to look up these words or understand what they're doing in the poem necessarily. It's not like being able to, look at a bilingual Indo-European language. So it may not have been something that endures, but to me, it's a moment of resistance. It shows the resistance in poetry. It shows cultural recovery, and survivance is the term that we use in Native Lit critic circles. That's Gerald Visner's term, but it enacts a survivance. This is how we are surviving. We are including our language. So I'm glad you noticed that, and I'm happy to note it. I'm also was really thrilled with Poetry Magazine that there were poems in Indigenous languages and essays, including predominantly Indigenous language in that issue. And it broke the longstanding rule of being English only. So for me, that was a great moment that those were accepted. There was never a question. And it wasn't until it came out that people started telling me, how did you get poetry to publish something that wasn't English? And I was like, they never asked, and I never had to push for it. And it was just it was a nice moment of, again, good editorial relationship.
I did not know that that was a long-standing rule for the journal, and it's so triggering. It reminds me of my experience going to elementary school, American Catholic school in the Philippines, and being sent to the principal's office if between the school hours I would not speak English and I would speak my language, Tagalog. And then in graduate school, when I was speaking to a very famous poet who was my advisor, looking at my work where I'm troubling English deliberately with my Filipino language and other languages, my Filipino language was described as the secondary language. So I can't thank you enough for breaking that ceiling in poetry. Certainly, I don't take that for granted. I was not aware that that was a rule in the journal, and kudos to the editors you worked with.
I don't know how long it was or if it was, broken before me, but the readers who noticed it mentioned it, and it wasn't just one or two. So, but I feel Indigenous First is a really important place to start for all of us when we think about the histories and cultures and the places that we live and the ways that we work with artists and writers. So that's how I proceed. I proceed with Indigenous First, and it has worked. I'm grateful to people who get that from, they don't question it.
I wanted to sort of go back to your early recounting of your experience working in the police department, but take us to this present moment that we're in. You have a book that's called Little Big Bully. The word bully for me is so obviously one thing. The past 2016, from 2016 to 2020, my experience with the President of the United States and their followers, but also how folks both on the left and the right are on social media, and you address a narcissist complex, and how social media really makes its way in there. Could you share with me your experience, be it individually or as someone who works in your Ojibwe communities or the larger BIPOC communities, Minnesota? What has the view been like for you in the wake of George Floyd? I had a program a couple of weeks ago with Patricia Spears Jones, Brian Talwara, who's from Minnesota, Joey DeJesus, and we were wrestling with the designations poet and American poet, particularly in this moment.
Paulo, you have asked a question I could probably spend 4 days on, and all of these questions have been so great and such depth, and I just want to do you justice in them. The poets you've mentioned, terrific poets. I've met them all. In Minnesota, we are very, very rich in poetry here. It may be the cold weather. There's really no other explanation for it. Maybe all the lakes we get to stare at and, mesmerize ourselves in front of. But for sure, it's the community that we have with one another. And that's something that I really want people to understand outside of the Twin Cities. We are not a devastated community. We expect the things that have happened to us. We have been fighting against them. The reason our response was so definitive and long lasting is because this is not new to us. As lovely as Minnesota sounds, a place that can support, numerous poets who do well here, it is also a place of incredible disparity. Native people are at the bottom of every statistic or at the height of every statistic we don't want to be at in this state. And it's just time to just speak. And I feel so full of that sense of our plurality, I really do, as poets, but also as a community. And there's many of these poets are really activists and really working at the forefront of everything and draw people toward that work. So we have that, and we recognize where we've been put. The bullying from a national standpoint of describing our cities as, burned out, and giving even people I know who don't live here the sense that it's a terrible place to live and that we've all just been devastated by, left-wing riots. Dispelling that notion is very difficult, but it's just not who we are. We are something so much better than that, and something that I think the whole country can be. So we're headed there, and I am absolutely certain of it. I'm utterly certain, and I've never been right before, so maybe maybe this time. I've never been wrong either. I never had any hopes or expectations. So this time I really feel like beyond this moment, and this moment has galvanized us.
I'm going to sneak in one more question, and I think you're absolutely right, Heid. We can keep talking, and as ever, these programs are an initial conversation with one another. But if you could tell me what's next for you, what do we have on the horizon for you? We have this book, which I encourage all our viewers to pick up ASAP. But let me know what's up for you the next month, the next year.
Well, this book is just my new book, Little Big Bully, is just, it's not even 2 weeks old, I think. And it is, it has knocked me for a loop, all the things that I'm doing with it. It's great to feel what, other poets have had, this sort of, ability to get your book out there, even during COVID times. I just feel my attention is on the book right now. I have some nonfiction projects that I have to finish, and some of my visual art collaborations are on hold too. So that's been difficult. And I'm a little bit more focused on my teaching and moving towards some ways to do some community work in a virtual setting. That's been difficult because I really can't go out and do the things I normally would do. And I've been really trying to figure out a way to, other than just Zoom meeting with people, how to be and help and be present the way I normally would. So I've got some pals in that project that we're trying to help each other do some work virtually, the ghost of us desperately trying to protest and take activism to whatever level we can. Yeah, that's our new job.
Well, the timing could not be more urgent, pressing, and wonderful for Heid's book to emerge just a few weeks out from our election. Thank you so much, Heid, for making the time to speak with me. I'm so grateful for it, and I look forward to hearing back from you and having this conversation again.
Miigwech, Paulo, Gigawabaman.
And to all our viewers tonight, thank you so much. Please keep safe, love one another, look out for each other, and until next time.
If you've enjoyed these programs, please consider giving a contribution to Poets House. For more than 30 years, they've kept the door wide open to everyone for the joy of poetry. Recently, they have temporarily had to shut the door and are reeling from the financial implications. Please give, even a small donation if you can. Thank you.